think we're set to go.
All right, great. So thanks to Ashley and Todd for agreeing to be discussing on my paper, giving me some feedback on this, and to Brad and Heason for helping organize this whole enterprise, which I think is really neat and a good thing. So I'll just sort of start. How did I had the share screen before. Where did the share screen button go?
So while Andres is getting the screen share ready, let me introduce all of our panelists. So welcome to the Online Peace Science Colloquium. I'm your co-host, Brad Smith. I'm an assistant professor at Vanderbilt University. My co-host is Cassie Dorff, who's also at Vanderbilt University. This week, we've got a nice presentation by Andres Gannon, who's a PhD candidate at University of California, San Diego. He's going to be presenting some work on alliance politics, which is near and dear to my heart. It's called Use Their Force, Interstate Security Alignments and the Distribution of Military Capabilities. We have some excellent discussants, Ashley Leeds, Rice University, and Todd Sechser from University of Virginia. And with that, I'll turn it over to Andres and get us started.
All right, great. Did the share screen work? You all can see a title slide there. Okay, great. So project is called Use Their Force, Interstate Security Alignments and Distribution of Military Capabilities. And an opening example that I'll start with is the Iran-Iraq tanker war that was happening towards the end of the 1980s. This war sort of started brewing in the early 1980s. Iran started laying a bunch of mines in the Gulf, which caused a freak out among the United States and a bunch of Western European countries about we have to do something to deal with this. The problem for the United States at the time was that it only had 3 minesweepers that were operational, which was sort of shocking for a country that under Reagan was in the midst of building a 600-ship Navy. The U.S. knew that minesweepers were important. 13 out of 15 U.S. ships that sank since the Korean War were sunk by mines. And these ships are not particularly complicated or expensive. It's fairly easy to build these things. So why was it that the United States was sort of caught with its pants down, in a sense, for not having a military capability that would have been very useful during this conflict? I think that that's emblematic of this sort of larger puzzle of capable states choosing force structures that seem to leave them vulnerable. We have the United States emitting minesweepers in the 1980s, and we have cases like Europe, Western Europe, not having any airlift capacity until very recently when they're starting to build this capacity. And I think that these two sort of cases are examples of this broader phenomena of military specialization, that states can choose to have a distribution of other military capabilities that is sometimes specialized, where they're omitting certain assets or overproducing others. And in other cases, countries are more of a jack of all trades, producing a little bit of everything. And the question is, why do we see some countries at certain times going in one direction versus the other? And my answer is, like Brad was saying, a question of allies, that the composition of a state's military is at least in part a function of its allied relations. That a state can specialize its military, either omitting the production of some assets or overproducing others, when it has a relationship with its allies that's conducive to intra-alliance bargaining. In other words, it can have a division of labor over the production of defense. You build the minesweepers, I'll build the aircraft carriers, and with our powers combined, we have the necessary naval configuration. But it's not just any alliance that does this. For this to happen, alliances that have closely aligned interests and a hierarchical relationship are ones that I think are more conducive to this kind of arrangement. And that's sort of what we saw in this Iran-Iraq tanker war case, where the United States, France, and the UK contributed aircraft carriers and destroyers and frigates to these operations, and Italy, Netherlands, and Belgium were the ones that sent in a lot of the minesweepers. So even though the US didn't have minesweepers that it could send, and Italy, the Netherlands, and Belgium didn't have destroyers, carriers, and frigates that it could really send, overall we sort of had the capacity that was needed to address this security conflict. And we see that this is a strategic logic that these countries were considering as well. A U.S. Naval Lieutenant Glazer at the time stated that while the submarines and major NATO combatants provide a welcome addition to our own blue water capabilities, the contribution of the Europeans' many small vessels might be even more important. Our resupply efforts and open ocean naval activity would be impossible if our allies cannot maintain mine-free entrances to the European ports and clear passages through restricted straits and channels. So my goals for today are to convince you that the distribution of states' military capabilities is something that matters. We should be concerned about it as scholars of international politics, that this is a political story that goes beyond just domestic politics and threat response models, which I think are largely how they're thought about now. that we can further explain this by having a political economy model of international cooperation. And in the particular paper I present here, I test it by looking at a division of defense labor among allied states in the year 2014. So that's sort of what I'll walk through today. So to start with disaggregating defense. So if we take measures that are commonly used by scholars of IR like military spending, France and Japan in 2014 are identical. They both spend about $50 billion of defense. And yet you don't need to be a defense specialist to know that France and Japan's militaries are not at all similar. They're spending this money in very different ways. They have different military capacities they can do. They have different defense needs. And so when we sort of black box military defense as something that is just the aggregate amount of spending, we're losing out on a lot of variation for what is this money going towards. If we look at it in the cases of France and Japan, these plots just show, as a percentage of the world share, how much does each country have of these particular assets. France has a lot of radar and a lot of logistical and maintenance vehicles. Japan has a lot more surface ships and coastal ships, and these are sort of intuitive to us when we think about Japan having a coastline, being an island nation, France having different needs within NATO and the history of its wars. And so my point is we should have this information and use this information beyond just aggregating military capacity. Military force should be seen as a toolkit, not just a tool that states can employ in international affairs. And we know that the exact composition of a state's military matters for a whole host of things that we're concerned about. It's how states impose political solutions during strategic interactions, and in the international security context, what a state has in its military influences things like who fights wars, who wins these wars. The cost, duration, and location of conflict is a function of what military capacity a state can bring to bear. Within international affairs, more generally, threat credibility, we sort of know a lot from the nuclear literature, depends on what specific military assets a country has. The balance of power and reputation are also a function of this. And even stepping back more broadly to just political science in general, the risk of coups and civil conflict, we know is affected by what military capacity states have. And domestic issues like budgets, interest group lobbying, public opinion are all things that it's not just the total amount of military spending, but what is in a state's military that matters. So if the composition of a state's military matters for a whole host of issues that we as scholars think are important, then where does this composition come from? Current explanation, you can start with the economic perspective that what a country has in its military is a function of factor endowments and geography. That states that have more money can spend more on their military. If you have a coastline, you have a bunch of boats. If you have land borders, then you'll have things that are relevant for land borders. It's sort of the initial very naive assumption that we can make from the economic perspective. If we look at social and domestic issues, then we know that things like military culture and prestige matter. It's, of course, more fun and sexy as a naval officer to be on an aircraft carrier as opposed to on a patrol boat. We know that services often have rivalries with one another for the types of things they're trying to have. And while I think that these social and domestic explanations are certainly true, I don't know that they have a predictive capacity for explaining specialization. I have yet to sort of really see a good theoretical insight for a country's military is more specialized because it has more lobbying, for example, or particular ideology of political leaders that matters. And if we turn to sort of their traditional realist IR explanations, we think of it as a threat response model. Let's assume that State A and State C are rivals in some sense and disagree about international affairs. State A should try to defend itself from State C by diversifying its military portfolio. You don't want to sort of be caught undefended if you can't defend yourself against amphibious assaults or against particular airstrikes. So you tend to diversify the military you have. And we see countries trying to do this a lot with nuclear platforms for having, ICBMs and SLBMs and bombers. That's the sort of logic of the triad. Now, if we add another state, State B, that also faces a threat from State C, now there's two different things that could happen. States A and B, who are both facing a threat from State C, under the defense under anarchy assumption, they will still do the same thing. They will individually diversify their military portfolios, thinking I can make myself best off by making sure that I just have all my bases covered. The defense under hierarchy assumption would assume that the efficient and smart thing for these states to do is to cooperatively specialize. We both have a common interest in having the same enemy, so let's each build different things, and with our powers combined, we still have this. And sort of this is where I sort of want to jump in with my theory is sometimes we see states diversifying, other times we see them specializing. So what is the nature of this blue relationship between states A and B? That means that sometimes we have individual diversification and sometimes we have cooperative specialization. So broadly speaking, I sort of have this chart here to just show here's sort of what I research in general. I'm interested in the technology of war and where these things come from. And while I'm focusing here on the relationship between alliances and the technology of war, I think that economic, domestic, and external threat issues are certainly still relevant. I'm not trying to disprove those particular theories or hypotheses, but simply demonstrate a value added to adding alliances to the picture and understanding the mechanism by which this happens. So I have sort of other projects outside of the dissertation that look at these other factors, and hopefully 10, 15, 50 years down the road, I've sort of combined all of these things into some neat little package. So what's the sort of problem of military specialization? Well, we know from economics literature that specialization is a really nice thing in a lot of ways. You gain economies of scale when there's certain things that you're just building over and over and over again. You gain operational efficiency from learning how to produce a certain capacity and sort of doing it over and over again. And you get improved integration. And sort of anyone who has had both a PC and an iPhone knows that even adding a single other operating system makes it more difficult for things to integrate with one another. And the same is true generally speaking. But there's also reasons it's really good to diversify, particularly in the military context. You have more capabilities that are available to you, the Swiss Army knife, so to speak. And as I said earlier, it can reduce your vulnerability if there's not a particular asset or attack strategy that a nation is vulnerable to. So the question is, why can't states both individually specialize and cooperatively diversify? And that's because having this specialized division of labor is not easy to do. The first thing you have to deal with is the risk of opportunism. It's hard to enforce cooperation under anarchy. If you're relying on a particular ally to bring the minesweepers and they don't show up on the day of the battle, that's really concerning, and that can be really tricky for a state to handle. So how do you prevent a state from just taking advantage of that? Second is the cost of coordination. It's hard enough for me to own both an iPhone and a PC, but if I have an iPhone and my mom now has a PC, I know exactly what's going to happen when I go home for Christmas. There's a bunch of troubleshooting that has to happen to make sure that these parts can work well together. And so getting this combined arms efficiency where a state's arms are more than the sum of its parts requires coordination that can be really difficult to do. And lastly, this is all happening in the realm of security, which is a really, really high stakes game for states. So while in economic realms, we sort of think that things like efficiency might matter, when it's the security of the state that is at stake, these questions, I think, are a lot more amplified, and these risks are something that policymakers are a lot more attuned to. So I theorize that states can specialize their militaries and have this division of labor when two conditions exist. The first is when there's interest alignment, meaning there's some consistency of security interests between them and their allies. And second is when there's a hierarchical relationship, the ability of one partner to set the terms of the security relationship. And I'll walk through these two a little bit more on the next two slides, but what they have in common is that they affect the intra-alliance bargaining environment, that these states have to decide, how do we have a cooperative security arrangement that can address the risk of opportunism and can address the costs of coordination, such that the benefits of that cooperation exceed the expected costs of these other two things. So interest alignment is when states agree on the nature of the threat environment and the mutual desirability of a particular way of addressing that threat. So this includes things like how salient is a particular threat, how much of a priority is it for states, the short or long-term nature of a threat, and how we sort of deal with it. And as states have higher interest alignment, that can minimize the expected cost of opportunism and coordination because it increases the value of cooperation, makes it self-reinforcing. I have an interest in making sure that there are not mines blocking the Strait of Hormuz, so I'm going to send them even if I could do otherwise. And this high payoff to coordination can produce, in some cases, conscious policy coordination. I think that this has often been seen as a necessary but not sufficient condition for states cooperating. And I think that I largely agree with that framework. For hierarchy, it's the ability of one partner to set the terms of the security relationship. And that can minimize the expected cost of opportunism and coordination for the dominant and the subordinate state in different ways. So the dominant state in a hierarchical alliance relationship can create conditions to offer buy-in. So they can say, hey, we will sort of be more benevolent and less coercive to you if we have some cooperative arrangement, which is sort of the argument made by Lake in his book. Or we see cases like the Soviet Union during the Cold War that have a more coercive relationship, where there's still a sort of power imbalance in some sense, but the way that works is it creates coercion. Soviet Union is able to tell, Poland, Bulgaria, et cetera, hey, your militaries are going to run a certain way or else. And we sort of saw the way that the Soviet Union dealt with threats in these particular circumstances involving that threat of coercion. So there's two different mechanisms by which they can happen that I detail more in a later chapter. For the subordinate state, making specialized contributions is a way that they can show that they're not a free rider. So we sort of see this, I think, in the NATO context, where you have states that are small states that don't have very large military budgets, don't have large sort of domestic industrial capacities, but they'll say, hey, I'm going to pick one or two small things that I can be really good at, show that I'm really good at it, and that's a way that I'm making a contribution to this sort of broader alliance architecture. So minesweepers are the example I walked through earlier. I think that Estonia being incredibly good at cyber and deciding we're not going to really have any tanks, but we're really, really good at cyber defense and cybersecurity as a way for them to show I have some value added to this alliance relationship, even though I'm just a low guy. So what do I mean by specialization? So I sort of spent a couple months reading a bunch of literature from biology and ecology on specialization, because I found that they had better ways of conceptualizing this than economic concepts through things like Herfindahl indexes and labor markets that assume things like there are no economic sectors that have 0 people employed. Or the size of these markets are roughly equal, or equal distribution across sectors is important. None of those things are really true in the security context. A country can have 11 aircraft carriers, 10,000 tanks, and still be an aircraft carrier country. And so measures from biology that account for how many elephants and ants exist in the same forest are sort of ways that we can capture some of this relationship. So to measure specialization, the first component is an entity, which for me is the country, just what is the agent that has some host of categories that exists. The categories are the objects that define the specialization for that entity. So for me, it's military technologies. And then you give a value to each entity category relationship that can be binary, that can be a count, that can be a ratio. And so there's a sort of have a spreadsheet of about 28 different ways that this thing can be measured in some capacity. And I'll walk through an example of one of the ones that I've chosen here. Now, the data that I'm using for this is I'm creating a new data set that is the Distribution of Military Capabilities data set, or what I'm calling RDMC. And this data set includes all COW states from 1970 to 2019, so about 7,500 country years, where the unit of analysis is the country year unit. So that's what each row represents. Now, the data is hierarchically nested, which means that we have 19 different equipment types, like a helicopter. Within that, we have 300 different equipment names, like a transport type of helicopter. And within that, we have 7,000 unique unit names, which is the Black Hawk is a type of transport helicopter that is a type of helicopter. And so the counts we have at the unit level using data from the military balance reports that are published by the International Institute for Strategic Studies, or IISS. And so what's nice about this hierarchical nesting is some people, to be honest, very few IR scholars I found are interested in the unique units, the Black Hawk versus the Apache helicopter. But we know that domestically that there's a lot of concerns about these on the procurement level. So we have that data. I'm mostly doing things at the equipment name level because states make decisions about transport helicopters versus attack helicopters that do very different things for sort of coercion, power, winning wars, making threats, et cetera, that matter to us. And we also have the sort of highest level of aggregation that allows us to just eyeball things from a 30,000 foot level. So the raw data looks roughly like this, where each of these annual reports is a PDF that lists out, for example, for New Zealand's Navy, here's how much New Zealand's Navy had of each of these different things in a given year. And so what I've been doing for the past couple years is turning this into a spreadsheet data format, where we sort of have each row is the P3K2 Orion, of which we see here that New Zealand's Navy had 3 of them. So that's an anti-submarine warfare type of aircraft. The C-130H Hercules is a medium transport aircraft, of which New Zealand had 5. The SH-2G Super Sea Sprite is an anti-submarine warfare helicopter, of which New Zealand had 5. So the final data sort of is turning these paragraph-style PDFs into a spreadsheet that has data at these particular levels, and a list of other covariates and descriptive statistics that help us understand that a little bit more. So now how do we get to specialization from this? Well, the first thing we have to measure is Monadic Specialization, which is for an individual country. How much is that country's military portfolio deviating from not what other states have, not from an equidistributional model, which is sort of the baseline in economics, but some random entity category value pairing. So we can turn the data into a wide format where each column represents a state, each row represents a technology, and each cell is how many of that technology did that state have in a given year. So this is sort of a stylized fake example where the state in this first column only has this third technology and they have a lot of it. So they sort of get 0.9, which is they're pretty high in terms of specialization. This fourth state kind of has a little bit of everything, and the things that they have are also things that other states have. So they get a 0.1. So what's nice about this measure is it accounts for differences in the overall quantity of these things that exist. So that if you have 11 out of the world's 20 aircraft carriers, like the United States does, you have a really, really dark red square there because there's not a lot of aircraft carriers in the world. As opposed to if you have 10,000 of the world's main battle tanks, there's a lot of other countries that have a lot of those. So it's not sort of as impressive or as specialized for you to have that asset. So that gives us a D prime score for every country. That we can then weight by the overall number of states, the overall number of technologies, and get a sort of score for each country for how specialized is their military capacity. From that, we can then look at a network or a collection of states, where if we pretend that these three squares are three different alliance configurations of 5 states, we can look at if we put these 5 states into a single box, how specialized is that overall box? So we see here on the left is an alliance configuration where everyone kind of has a bit of everything. There's a lot of overlap and redundancy. And as you move to the right, we sort of have the most extreme example where each state is only doing a single thing. They're doing a lot of that thing, and no other state is doing that thing. So these measures are derived from that D prime score and gives us this H2 score. That citations for the biology literature on this are in the paper, but the names are long, so I didn't put them on the slides. So we can sort of get a score for each square here. So what the research design I've done in this particular study is my unit of analysis is a network. So that last slide, a collection or configuration of states. I'm looking just at 2014 because dealing with the time series component of this has some methodological challenges I haven't quite worked through yet. And there's a lot of data cleaning that's involved in this, and I wanted to use a subsample of the data that I knew was perfectly clean. My dependent variable is how specialized is a particular network, and my explanatory variable is this network an actual alliance network? So the model is a synthetic network simulation where I take 1,000 random configurations of states, I pretend that they are alliances, and I give that quote-unquote alliance a score for how specialized is that alliance? What is their division of labor that they have? And that is done using a nested metric based on overlap and decreasing fill, an ODF score. That's basically just the opposite of a network specialization score. And what I do is I then compare those simulations to the actual alliances that exist in the year 2014 and see what's the difference. Do the true alliance configurations have more or less specialization than these synthetic ones made up of random configurations of countries? And so what I find here, is just sort of the first graph I have to show the results, is that this black bar is the simulated alliance configuration. So when we take 1,000 random networks and ask the model, how specialized are these countries' militaries, we get a value of around 85, which means there's a fair amount of overlap in what military capacities these states have. There's not much specialization. There's not much of a division of labor. When we then compare that to the actual alliance configurations that exist in 2014, that's the red line. And I realized that should be a bar because there's more than one of them. So I need to fix that later. But the important part is that red bar is to the left, which means that true alliances in the year 2014 have more specialization, more of a division of labor, and less of a overlap in military capacity than 1,000 random configurations of states. So I think that gives like some plausible idea that the military configurations of alliances are in some way different from what a state's military would look like if it wasn't considering its alliance relationships when deciding how to make its military portfolio. So it's not an accident that the United States didn't have any minesweepers in the 1980s. There was something about who its allies were and who it thought could bring those minesweepers that was relevant in that decision. So I think that this matters for a lot of reasons. I think a lot of the discussions we've had about burden sharing costs, a lot of the very timely this week, given the NATO summit discussions over burden sharing, should really think about burden sharing configurations that we sort of hear a lot in the news and in DC and policy circles about the 2% benchmark. What I think is more important to look at is what are these countries spending that 2% on? two countries, country that's spending 1.7% of their GDP on defense might be giving more to the alliance than a state that's spending 2% if what it's contributing is some unique specialized assets that alliance would lose out on by not having access to, as opposed to a country that's bringing some redundant capacity might have less value added to the alliance, but we lose that distinction in the way that we're thinking about these questions now. And when countries do this, in some cases, it can be really cost saving. The United States didn't have to build minesweepers in the 80s, and that worked out okay because our allies had these minesweepers. But in other cases, it can be costly. We saw during the Iraq War that the United States relied on Germany to bring the WMD inspection vehicles, and there was a delay in the speed at which that thing happened. During the Cold War, France was reliant on the U.S. for heavy airlift, heavy transport capacity. The U.S. was dragging its feet in giving those things, and people argue that explains why France has so many military bases in Africa. They had to build those things because they were unable to rely on the United States to get sort of quick transportation of personnel, because that division of labor let us down. And in the sort of other empirical chapter I look at cases like Kosovo, where we sort of had this accusation by Europeans of being just spear carriers for the United States, which caused some resentment, and these discussions are happening now. And I think that we should sort of shift the discussion from allies versus armaments, a way that we've thought about this alliance relationship, to allies as armaments. That the state, I don't think, is the appropriate unit of analysis when thinking about what a state's military capacity is. That instead we should zoom that out and think about the assets of a country's allies and the sort of nature of their relationship to those allies as affecting the military capacities that we think a state can bring to bear. And when we look at ways in which countries might try to innovate or change their military configuration, looking at its relationship to its allies, I think, is a useful place in a lot of cases for explaining the direction that those changes might take. So I think that my contribution here theoretically is thinking about specialization as a division of labor that can solve this enforcement problem by compartmentalizing cooperation. Here's sort of a way that states are able to cooperate in the security realm in ways that avoids a lot of the sort of typically understood problems of cooperation under anarchy, a specific mechanism by which this happens. And empirically, I think that this new data on state military capacities has a host of other applications that could give me a lifetime of things to research, but hopefully for a lot of other scholars as well. And I think that there's a lot of questions that we've looked at that assume aggregated military capacity that we can sort of go back and look at again with this disaggregated military information to sort of see how these theories hold up. Next steps for this project, I presented here sort of the first cut of one of the quantitative chapters. I need to broaden the temporal scale. I sort of have data from 1970 to the present, and once I figure out the sort of modeling issues and comparing that across time, I think that that'll be really helpful at showing more of this. I think that here I've sort of assumed just random combinations of state capacity counts. I think that that's not true because economic capacity of states and geography are things that I want to include in this sort of null baseline. Countries that have longer coastlines should have more of an interest in getting naval capacities. Countries that have more land borders should have more interest in land capacity. And the United States should not get to grab 10 things and Ireland get to grab 10 things in the model, which is the way that it works now. So you need to figure out some ways to include those two things as the economic baseline. I also need, I'm looking at modeling who within an alliance specializes. In one of my empirical chapters is looking to compare the NATO with the Warsaw Pact during the Cold War that differ in terms of their hierarchy and interest alignment relationship. And I have sort of suspicions about why NATO is if I was to create an alliance that would be as good as possible for a division of labor and specialization, NATO is pretty close to what I would do. And so comparing that to other alliance configurations that have either less interest alignment or less of a hierarchical relationship, I think it will shed light on which of those mechanisms are driving specialization to what degrees. And then I also will sort of move away from try non-network models and multi-level models that can instead account for things like varying distributions that exist for these technologies, for states, for time, and uncertainties we have. We know a lot more about how many aircraft carriers countries have than how many missiles, for example. And so I think that there's sort of more complex ways to think about those parameterizations that will sort of give me more confidence in the initial results that I have found so far. So those are the thoughts that I have for this portion here. Thank you all again for taking the time to listen and read the paper, and I'm looking forward to your thoughts.
Great. Thanks, Andres. Okay, so we can, I think we're ready to move on to the discussion. So I'll turn it over to our discussants. I don't know if Ashley or Todd, either one of you would like to jump in and get us started off.
I'm happy to start. Okay. So let me just, thanks so much for sharing this research with us. And so what I was thinking I'd give just sort of an overall reaction to the paper and the project where it is right now, and then raise some issues that I think that we can talk about and have Todd give his overview as well before we do that. So in the first half of your paper, I was super excited, right? I love this topic. And what I found really relevant to our current situation in the world is two things. First of all, I think I really think the debate about free riding and alliances is misplaced. And the reason I think that is I think it ignores why anyone creates an alliance to begin with. The idea of creating an alliance is that you can change your defense spending. If you were not going to change your defense spending, then why do we benefit from an alliance, right? And so thinking more about how people contribute rather than assuming everyone contributes in kind and that it can all be measured by cost and that everybody contributes based on the same issues, I think is really helpful, particularly given some of the policy debates that are going on currently, which is inspiring a lot of research about who free rides and who doesn't, which usually just looks at defense spending. And I think your point there is incredibly well taken and very timely. The other thing that I think is really relevant to our current situation for what you talk about is this idea that we can tell something about how reliable members think alliances are independent of some kind of military challenge. And where that comes in is, we have a lot of discussion about changes in the US, changes in Britain, about people saying, nobody's going to trust the US anymore. And the fact is, I think the idea that nobody would want to ally with the US is probably unfounded, right? The US just has too much to bring to the table. On the other hand, the idea that behavior by the US doesn't influence how other people act is also unreasonable, right? And so I expect that where we're likely to see the costs of unreliability are less in sort of the big decisions, I will be your ally or not, but how we behave in the hedging we do in preparing for our own defense, the other allies that we seek, the way we define our force structures to be more independent, and in a sense, make the alliance in turn less valuable, right? So I think both for thinking about a free riding issue and for thinking about alliance reliability and the costs and benefits thereof, thinking in these more fine-grained terms rather than just yes or no, sort of a dichotomous value, I think is super important and relevant. The other thing that I think you've done really well is, and this isn't so much my area of expertise, but I was both impressed and able to follow it all, which is saying a lot, is the definition of specialization and really thinking about how we conceptualize specialization in the military. And it really helped me think about things that way. So I commend you on that as well. The areas where I think the current draft, I think we can offer you some suggestions for improvement, are in some sense areas that you already defined for further research. And that is, I got to about the middle of the paper and it stopped going where I thought it was going. And I think that came about first in, you talk about interest alignment and hierarchy. And I felt like I had a number of questions about the hierarchy portion in particular, but interest alignment and hierarchy overall. You talked a little bit more in the presentation, but I'd like to push you a little bit on your arguments there. And then where I really felt like we took a different turn was when we got to the hypothesis, which had nothing to do with interest alignment and hierarchy. I think that starting with a baseline of comparing whether all alliances are different from all non-alliances is a useful baseline to start with, and that's where you went. But I think that what your paper comes across as is that your project is going to be about differentiating alliances from each other. And I'm glad to see that's where you're going, and that's something else that I think we can talk about. And a particular technical question that I had for you is, you say here you're using ATOP alliances. And one of the things I was curious about is this just the defense and offense paths? Because 50% of the alliances are non-aggression, neutrality, confrontation, and you wouldn't expect there to be an expectation of, well, maybe some people would. I think that they're defined that way because they're not necessarily designed for fighting together. So I think that would be a crucial distinction, is to look at the alliances that are really designed for joint fighting versus alliances that are explicitly for a different approach to conflict. So I'll just stop there in terms of my overall feelings about where the conversation might be most productive, and let Todd jump in and see if he agrees or disagrees, and we can see where to go from there.
Great. Yeah, I agree. It's the short answer. I agree, number one, that I found this paper really terrific. I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a great question. I think you thought very thoroughly about how to measure your key variable of interest, much more thoroughly than I think anybody has thought about it in this literature by far. I thought that was really impressive. I thought the argument was plausible. It was even more well developed probably than it even needed to be. I think it's a believable argument. It makes sense to me. I basically buy it. And the data collection project is just extraordinary. And I really just cannot overstate how incredible it is to go through all these years. I mean, I went, to my own research, I've been through the military balance to code just a couple of things. It just takes forever. And so, the fact that you have done this for all countries, all weapon platforms, for all these years is really an incredible contribution, and is very impressive. I have a couple of comments that I wanted to make. One was about the theory, and Ashley really already pointed this out, which is that you have a great set of hypotheses about the conditions under which allies specialize. Some alliances should have a high degree of division of labor, and others should have a lower degree. But you don't show that, right? You have a great argument, and I think it's a reasonable argument, although I have some questions about that. But ultimately, there's no evidence that, or you don't try to distinguish between different types of alliances with high degrees of common interests and hierarchy versus those without. So, once you get there, and clearly you're going in that direction, that will make the project, I think, a lot more compelling. That's one argument, or one observation. A second observation is I'm not totally sure that I'm convinced that allies would want to specialize. And I think this part of the paper could use a little bit more development, because you have this nice section where, sort of objective overview, specialization has costs, it has benefits, but I found the cost to be a lot more compelling than the benefits. The benefits are, you don't have to train your pilots, or 14 different kinds of pilots. You can only train, 2 or 3. The coordination problems are a little bit lower. But then the costs are, in the event of a conflict, you could be left without a key weapons platform that would leave you vulnerable to certain types of attacks or unable to perform certain kinds of missions. And that just seems so much more serious than the potential cost savings or transaction cost savings in trying to specialize. So I would like to hear more in the paper about exactly why countries would want to do this. What are the benefits, the security benefits, not trivial transaction costs or small amounts of spending, but what are the security benefits from specializing? I think that argument can be made, but I would just like to hear a little bit more about it. And then lastly, I would like to hear a little bit more about the story that you're envisioning about how specialization happens, because it could happen in a variety of ways. One is that countries band together, they form an alliance, and then they sort of hash out what are the different military functions that each country will specialize in. If that's really happening, that'd be really interesting. You didn't provide any direct evidence. Now, this is just obviously one chapter, so there's no evidence yet that that's happening. Maybe it is, and I would love to hear about the stories about countries actually hashing out, what's the division of labor. But there is an alternative story, right, which is that countries look for allies that can supplement capabilities that they are limited in themselves, right? So, nuclear weapons would be one big obvious case, right? Countries look for allies that have nuclear weapons because they don't have them themselves, and they view them as reliable deterrents. And then a third possible story is that countries don't specialize until they get into alliances, and then they free ride. So specialization could be a consequence of greater cooperation on the one hand, or it could be a consequence of free riding on the other hand. And those are two very different stories about meaning of specialization and the meaning of force structure within alliances that tell us something very different about the world. The data you're presenting can't really distinguish or tease out between those two stories. But I would just like to hear a little bit more about your thoughts about which one is going on. Both, I think, are your evidence is consistent with both of them, but they have very different implications. And then a very sort of last observation here is really a positive one, which is the way that you frame the paper is you frame it in a variety of different ways. And I would just suggest trying to emphasize one over the other. It's a great problem to have, that you can frame it in many different ways and still be contributing to literature. But I think you ought to maybe commit to one over the other. You sort of have small questions or small ways of framing it. What determines force structure? That's a small question that has, an audience out there. But I think this is actually, more fruitfully framed in a much broader way, which is that this is a story about self-help versus cooperation.
Yeah.
Big debates, big literatures that are out there, and this is contributing to that, and offering some interesting insights that will have a much bigger audience than just the force structure literature that's out there. But I thought it was a really great paper. It was really impressive.
Yeah, I agree with Ashley and Todd. I think this is really, really nice work. I think this is something that, I think this paper has the quality of a lot of great papers, which is, I read it and I thought someone should have thought about this before, right? This is, I thought, like, why has no one done this? And I'm glad someone is. So I'll add one thought before give you a chance to respond. So I had a similar reaction to one of the things that Todd brought up, which is it seems like the benefits are relatively scant in comparison to the potential costs. And I wonder if there's sort of a theoretical angle that you could take that you're not taking now in the paper, which is, I wonder if this specialization is sort of a way to provide a costly signal of your commitment, right? And especially in these kinds of, a lot of the lead-in of the paper, the U.S., foregoing these minesweeping capabilities, it sort of conjures up this picture of an asymmetric alliance where the protege might be concerned about the defender's commitment. And I wonder whether the U.S. sort of foregoing that, in the grand scheme of things, seemingly relatively minor capability, and sort of, delegating that to a weaker ally provides a costly signal, right? Because there is cost entailed, there's expected cost entailed. If Belgium chooses, or the Netherlands chooses to not cooperate, that the U.S. is going to have to invest in those capabilities themselves, and so there's an expected cost there, and that's going to provide a way to provide a costly signal of commitment both to the protege and to a potential adversary. And I can sort of imagine a theoretical model where you could explore that specialization as a way to send a costly signal of commitment to one another, to an adversary. And I think that might be novel. I don't know of anyone that's thought about that before. That might be an interesting avenue that would complement the kind of thing you're doing here. I have some other thoughts, but I'll give you a chance to respond, and then we can keep going with the Q&A.
Okay. Great, thank you all. Those are super useful comments. I agree with a lot of the things that you all have said that are on my to-do list or have been on my to-do list, and that I'm sort of working through. I sort of take the three of the big picture comments. The first about sort of testing the type of alliances. So there's sort of always the problem. I didn't want to send you all like 200 pages of a random thought sets. Hey, here's the whole dissertation, on the operating table with blood and guts everywhere. So the way that I'm thinking of it so far is the 3 empirical tests are first. The first stage is, do alliances matter, as you all said? Do we see a difference within groups of division of labor between alliances and non-alliances? Then the second part of the theory is, who specializes within an alliance, and what are the configurations that mean that some alliances have more or less than others? And so that's the one where I'm hoping to focus on NATO and the Warsaw Pact as 2 examples where we know a lot about how those alliances exist. I have a lot of evidence so far that there's sort of anecdotal ways in which they differed in terms of their specialization, where the main difference is, does the dominant state specialize? In the sort of NATO case, there's a lot more of the dominant state specializing for some of the reasons I think that Brad brought up. It's a way of signaling your commitment. I think that there's ways in which hierarchies are trying to, some hierarchical states, when they have close interest alignment, are trying to show that there's some mutual vulnerability by doing like a mutual hostage taking situation, which is, I will specialize because I think it creates some buy-in to this arrangement where you think I won't have to be coercive. We see a lot less of that in the Soviet case, where a lot of the satellite states were specialized, but the Soviet Union said, I don't trust the Bulgarians at all. I'm not going to give up any capacity and rely on the Bulgarians for it. So there's sort of one-way reliance that exists within different alliance arrangements. And I think part of that is the degree to which interest alignment means you care about having that mutual hostage taking, creating some buy-in, or is this a coercive type of relationship where you say, I'm just going to make my sort of smaller proteges do what I make them do, but if they fail, I'm still okay. So that chapter, I'm hoping to flush through those arrangements a little bit. And then the third is sort of a more qualitative and what I'm calling large and descriptive chapter that looks at the former Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact states after the collapse of the Cold War, where a lot of these countries basically, or in some cases literally, had to start their militaries from scratch. We have a chunk that went west towards NATO, a chunk that went a little bit more east, and some that just kind of stayed in the middle. And we sort of have a lot of good historical and archival evidence about what are the decision-making processes that these states were making at the time about, hey, if I want to join NATO, what are the things that I need to do to be seen as militarily useful, which was the calculation for a lot of states, to ensure that NATO is going to rely on me, and to ensure that I can rely successfully on NATO. So I think one of the points that Brad brought up about the mechanism is I do think part of it is sort of a catch me, I'm falling logic that smaller states do in alliances for specialization. And that when the sort of inverse, that a different way of thinking about entrapment problems is that's good for the smaller states to do, is to create conditions where the powerful states that you're allied with realize we have to defend this state because they can't do it by themselves. I think, for example, Estonia's biggest mistake would be to give NATO the impression that they can defend their land border in some way by themselves. That's a horrible idea. They're way better off saying, hey, we're going to give you all a bunch of cyber knowledge. We're really good at that. But if a tank rolls across the border, we've got nothing, and you got to be there in about 6 hours. And so I think that that's a way in which there is a logic of specialization, strengthening the alliance by creating mutual vulnerability in a lot of cases. And there are some alliances where that mutual vulnerability will work and will be trusted. And in other cases, the Soviet Union says we don't want mutual vulnerability with our smaller states. And so I hope to walk through those relationships there a little bit. I sort of already talked about the second point a little bit, the sort of security benefits of specializing. The costly signal of commitment thing I think is true and is an argument that I like. And the sort of mutual hostage taking example I want to do a little bit more of there in those cases. One thing that I haven't talked about a lot here that I've just sort of been struggling with in general is for that costly signal of commitment and mutual vulnerability to exist, there has to be asset specificity to the things that countries are specializing in. And I've sort of walked through this a little bit. I have the logic there, but empirically identifying it is tough, where if what the Netherlands had was a bunch of small transport helicopters, that doesn't create the same mutual vulnerability, because if they abandon us, the US can just build and or send them very, very quickly. And there's sort of other things where that isn't really the case. And so I think that when we see cases of countries specializing in things that have high asset specificity, like special operations forces is one that we see for a lot of the NATO countries that are joining NATO in the later waves. Things that are geographic or regional specific and hard to move are a big thing as well. So a lot of the sort of former Soviet Union states, when they joined NATO, they're like, we're going to have a lot of just air defense things that are really, really hard to move via plane. And it makes sense for us to have these things given where we are. And if we don't have these things or don't use them, that's really costly for NATO because it's hard to replace those things, just given the geography of the way that these things work. The other place we saw that in an interesting way was during the Cold War. Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, their navies for a period really only had anti-submarine warfare. Given where they were located, the United States and the rest of NATO said that you all are close enough to the Soviet Union and where you're located, you just need to be able to find the submarines. And we sort of see a lot of evidence of some, not quite a divorce, but some mild fights that happened with the US and Canada during the 70s, where Canada said, we don't like just building this particular thing. We're not sure that you're going to come to our defense when these things happen. And they started building other naval assets, despite the US doing things like trying to sell them anti-submarine warfare super, super cheap. So that'd be the thing that they were good at. And so that's sort of ways that we see this asset specificity component come in that I think is hard to get at quantitatively, but I hope that the sort of qualitative and historical evidence that I have gets at some of these things like production lead time and things like that. The last point was about the sort of mechanisms that I think are driving this, whether this is free riding or buy-in. I think I've sort of become more of an alliance optimist and thinking that it's more of a buy-in story rather than a free riding story. I think there's ways in which when countries are, the new term I've heard is when they're cheap writing, they need to do something to show that it's not cheap, that what they're contributing actually does something useful, and that if they were not to do that, it would be costly. So another paper that I have on the war in Afghanistan looks at exactly this, where I don't think it's a coincidence that it was a ton of the countries bordering Russia that were really, really committed to helping out the United States in Afghanistan, because it sort of wanted to show like, hey, we scratch your back. When the tanks come rolling in, will you scratch ours? And I think it was either Latvia or Lithuania that went so far as during the early periods of the Afghan war, they changed their military uniforms to be desert camouflage, which, if you think about the Baltic, doesn't make any sense. But it does make sense if you just plan on fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan alongside the United States to show that you're a committed partner. And so that's not sort of a military equipment story, but I think it gives an example of a sort of buy-in that I think these states are trying to do to avoid the larger countries in the alliance acting opportunistically in those cases. So those are some thoughts I have on sort of the broader context. I need to figure out ways to frame the stage one of theory. Alliances, yes, no, here's a test. What kinds of alliances and who in alliances, here's a test. And then here's evidence on the sort of post-Cold War cases. But the copy and pasting into a paper for one particular thing explains the difference that I thank you all for pointing that out. And something I'm working on for this.
So Andres, it seems to me like after all the work you've done to operationalize quantitatively this variable, that it would be a shame not to push the large end further also, right? I get that you want to do the NATO Warsaw Pact comparison, but just comparing NATO and Warsaw Pact is not going to get it all. You just don't have enough degrees of freedom to handle a lot of other things that you might manage. So I would encourage you to think about expanding your large N test also in the line of some of your hypotheses. And along those lines, I have some questions about the hypotheses themselves that you might develop over time, if that's okay, Brad. Is that okay?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So, so the first thing you talk about is interest alignment. And I think what comes across in the paper is that you're using this for a substitute to argue that what makes interest alignment important is that it makes people more confident of reliability, right? That because our interests are shared, I don't have to worry about you abandoning me, right? And I think if the key variable is reliability rather than interest alignment, then what you might think about are what are the alternative things that create that sense of reliability that would allow someone to invest in this manner. And in particular, I'd encourage you to think about that given the asset specificity you're talking about, that I think any of these decisions about what equipment you have are reasonably long-run decisions, right? They're not things that you can change very quickly. So what I worry about is, for instance, one could imagine circumstances in which we agree this year we're fighting a war together, and therefore we completely agree on what the threat is and how we want to deal with it. But that in no way suggests that our interests are aligned in the long run, right? So the definition that you're using about agreeing on who the threat is and what the response to that would be could have short run or long run implications. What you're really interested in is, am I confident in reliability for the long run? And I totally agree that strategic incentives and political incentives are a big part of that. And thinking about what things identify that kind of long-term interest alignment would be good. But the other thing that I'd encourage you to think about is how institutionally can alliances be designed to improve that and to create the conditions for long-term agreement. So I think you can also get some leverage on types of alliances by thinking about the reliability side. Then we come to the hierarchy side. And frankly, reading the paper, I wasn't entirely sure about sort of what the mechanism behind the relationship with hierarchy is. In your presentation, what I took away is that this is about solving the bargaining problem. That basically we can come to a bargaining solution easily because the hegemon just says, here's what we're going to do, right? And can provide the side payments or enforcement to ensure that. My reaction to that is a lot of alliances aren't that many states, right? It's not obvious to me that we have a huge coordination problem here. And so I think that really what you want to focus on this second component, the first component was about, am I even willing to make this investment because, do I have long-term confidence in this arrangement? The second component is, can we reach a bargain solution, right? How is it that we're going to get to agree on what this specialization should look like? Because we're not going to have any specialization if we can never agree on who's doing what, right? And so I think if you think broadly about this question of reliability and then about successful bargaining, I think there are substitutes for hierarchy in bargaining under some circumstances. And I think it depends a bit on how broad how big the alliance is, how many states are involved, how similar their force structures and all are before they get there. I can imagine cases where this bargaining isn't that hard. I can imagine other cases where the bargaining is really difficult and doesn't get achieved. So that framing just might give you a broader way to think about those two things, and then could give you more variables that you could think about affecting each one of those that you could test in this large environment.
Yeah, so if I could sort of jump in and build on some of Ashley's comments, I had a similar thought when I read through, is that I think there's a lot of opportunity for more observable implications of your theory, because it seems like the empirical component of what you're doing is really oriented around no alliance versus alliance. And then when I think about, what we know from a lot of Ashley's work, for example, is that, sort of holding fixed the institutional features of a particular alliance, we would expect that the perceptions of reliability might fluctuate over time based on outside factors. And so sort of leveraging that variation in the perceptions of reliability could give you another way to think about, what might lead to variation over time and specialization. Of course, there's going to be a lot of stickiness, but I just want to kind of echo that. I think there's a lot of room for other testable implications of this general kind of theory that you're building.
Yeah, that makes sense. The large end stuff is what I'm most excited about. Is sort of I like the data. That's sort of what started the project and whatnot. And I think I've wrapped my head around the sort of way to measure the left-hand side specialization after reading about bees and alligator diets a lot. Sort of the right-hand side is where things get a little trickier. So I started with just alliance yes no, because I could figure that one out in a model. The lists I've gone through of just how do I operationalize interest alignment and hierarchy is now where things get trickier. And thinking about it more broadly, I think will help for ways that I can get that. But I think that's probably my next step for the quantitative part of this project, is thinking about what are observables for the right-hand side that I think would matter. and walking through the mechanisms by which these things could matter, and then testing the degree to which those things are true. But that's been sort of the hang up there a little bit.
And what you'll have to deal with when you do this also is this question of endogeneity and what causes what, right? Yes. And so, to what extent do these institutional structures cause specialization, and to what extent does specialization require these institutional structures, et cetera? And so, those are other things that you'll have to grapple with. That being said, I think a lot of the data, I can imagine ways to evaluate this, and we have a lot of data available to do that, right? And so, I don't want to see you give up on that side, because I think given all the work you've done on operationalizing specialization broadly, I think people are going to want to see more than that alliances are different from randomly grouped states.
I'll make a plug here for doing not more sophisticated, but actually less sophisticated presentation of some of the data. You have so much data, and you have the chart that just shows the distribution of specialization scores. But I'd love to see more than that. I would just like to know, what do the specialization scores of different alliances look like?
Yeah.
I agree with that.
Just eyeballing your distribution. To me, the upper echelon of countries that have high specialization scores don't necessarily look like the countries that I would think of as highly dependent on alliance patrons. Maybe not though, but you have a lot of these microstates, Barbados, East Timor are up toward the top, and that's not to question the finding, but it's just a very interesting pattern that we're seeing, where we're not looking at NATO states or even Warsaw Pact states that are up at the top of that distribution, and I'm just curious about why. And I would love to know, how does NATO compare to the Rio Pact, or to the Warsaw Pact, or other types of alliances? So just describing the data, you have a lot of opportunity there, and any paper you try to publish, I hope you will do that extensively, just so readers can learn what does this landscape look like.
Yeah, I agree. There's got to be a lot of fascinating stuff in this data, and I would just like to see a lot of descriptive stuff. You can do that in the book, right? So I hate to cut us off. It's been a great discussion, really, really interesting work, but we've got about 2 minutes shy of an hour. And so I'll give Andres, just if you want to wrap up and have any last thoughts before we conclude here.
First, just thank you again to all of you for giving me thoughts on this. It's super useful and really helpful. It's exciting for me. I'm still on the honeymoon stage of not hating my project, which is good news. So the plan is, like I said to you all in email, is to be on the market next fall. So I think my plan is, focusing on the quantitative empirical part is something I want to do. I sort of have figured out the measurement for the left-hand side, and so just look at the summary stat plots for these alliances. That'll be helpful. Think about alliances in a bit more of a complex way, and getting to that second stage of the theory. That's not just alliances, yes, no, but what about alliances does this, and who within an alliance specializes, are the places where this can sort of have the most contribution that exists there. I think that's sort of the takeaway thoughts that I have, but this has been super useful. Thank you all again, and hopefully you'll be seeing it again at some point in the future, and there's been forward progress that's been made, and you all definitely have a role in helping with that.
Thanks for sharing it.
Yeah, thank you, Andres. And thank you, Ashley and Todd, for offering excellent discussion. I'm sure it was very useful for Andres, and it was very, very, very fun to join in. So for everyone watching at home or in your offices, just a reminder that our next and final session of the semester is going to be a week from today on December 13th. We're going to have Roya Talibova, who's a PhD candidate at the University of Michigan, and Carly Wayne, who's an assistant professor at WashU in St. Louis. They're going to be presenting a paper called "They Hate Our Freedom, a New Global Data Set of Terrorist Group Motives." So make sure to check that out next week. And just a reminder, you can subscribe to the Online Peace Science Colloquium on your favorite venue of choice. We're on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, anything imaginable. You can look at the papers on our website, and also look out for the spring call for papers that will be coming through your email soon. And everybody send us your great work so that you can get feedback on it. So with that, we'll sign off. Thanks. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.